Lecture 19, Virgil.
Welcome to Lecture 19, in which we continue our discussion of Roman literature by moving on to the work of the great poet Virgil. Like Horace, Virgil was a protege of Maecenas, and of course Virgil is most famous to modern readers for his great epic work, the Aeneid, the foundation story of the Roman people. Publius Virgilius Maro, or Virgil, as he's normally pronounced in English, was born on October 15th, 70 BC, and he died on September 20th, 19 BC. Like Horace and Catullus, Virgil was not born in Rome. He was born in the provinces, Mantua in his case. And by the time he began to work on the Aeneid, he was already an experienced poet, but he had not previously written an epic. His first work, the Eclogues, was a collection of 10 bucolic poems, probably published around 38 BC. His second work, the Georgics, was completed after 29 BC. That's dedicated to Maecenas as his patron, and it deals with agriculture and the old-fashioned virtues of farming and the farmer's life. Now, in both Eclogues and Georgics, Virgil talks of writing an epic, so apparently the idea had been with him for some time, even before he started work on the Aeneid. The Aeneid was unfinished at the time of Virgil's death in 19 BC. And there is a tradition that comes down to us from the grammarian Servius, writing in the 4th century AD, that on his deathbed, Virgil asked for the manuscript of the Aeneid to be burned. He was so dissatisfied with what he had managed to accomplish in this epic that he would prefer for it to be burned flat out than for it to go before the world in its incomplete state. Now, as I say, this is a story that's recounted by someone writing some 4 centuries after Virgil's own lifetime, and so you have to decide just how many grains of salt you want to take that story with. It is both a wonderful and a horrifying idea that we could have lost the Aeneid entirely because Virgil was so dissatisfied with it at the time of his death. We do know that the Aeneid is, in fact, unfinished. We know that because there are present in the text what scholars call half-lines, that is, incomplete lines of dactylic hexameter, lines that do not fill out the full metrical dactylic hexameter verse of epic. And dactylic hexameter is a very regular formal verse. It's not the kind of poetry where one could decide to leave a half-line for poetic effect. So the presence of half-lines tells us that Virgil had not quite finished the Aeneid at the time of his death. Also, there are a few inconsistencies of plot left in the text that most scholars think also indicate the incomplete nature of the work as it's come down to us. Now, I don't want to make it sound like it's half finished. It's very, very close to complete as far as we can tell. But there are these few little inconsistencies left in plot and a few half-lines that seem to indicate that the tradition is correct insofar as it says Virgil hadn't completed the Aeneid at the time of his death. The same tradition also tells us that Augustus stepped in and forbade the burning of the manuscript and appointed 2 friends of Virgil's to go over the text, to amend it for publication, but not to add anything to it, so that what we have in the Aeneid is Virgil's words and Virgil's words only. Now, the Aeneid is Rome's great national epic, by which I mean that it draws not only on the mythical past of the Trojan War for its own setting, but also on the Augustan present. It looks back to the mythical past of Troy and Aeneas's flight from Troy, but it also very much looks forward to the present day in Rome under Augustus. Virgil drew on Homer, obviously, for form and for style. He's writing an epic, he's writing in dactylic hexameter, and he also drew on Homer for many of the elements of his narrative, of his storyline. But there are many obvious and important differences from Homeric epic that come into focus with the very opening lines of the Aeneid. The proem of the Aeneid, the first 11 lines in which Virgil introduces his subject matter, right away make it clear both what he owes to Homer and how he is setting himself apart from Homer. The very opening words of the Aeneid, arma virumque cano, make both the debt to Homer and the difference from Homer abundantly clear. Those words mean, I sing of arms and of a man. Now, arms and a man clearly reference the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Iliad, a poem about warfare, the Odyssey, a poem about the wanderings of one man. In fact, the very first word of the Odyssey in Greek is man. The first line is, Muse, sing to me of the man of many turnings. So when Virgil opens his epic with arms and the man I sing, he is telling us, in effect, I'm doing an Iliad and an Odyssey both. I'm singing about warfare and about the wanderings of one particular man. But think of the verb, kano, I sing. Virgil does not open his epic by calling upon the muse for inspiration, as Homer does. He doesn't say, Muse, sing to me about Aeneas. Instead, he says, I sing arms and the man. In other words, he reminds us right away, this is not the work of oral tradition. This is the work of one poet crafting his story himself. The Aeneid also is written with hindsight and with a view to subsequent history in a way that's completely unlike the Homeric epics. Now, later Greek people did certainly trace their own ancestry back to Homer. There's no question of that. But the Homeric epics were there, and people living 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 centuries later looked at their own lives, their own ancestries, their own families, the events of their own culture, and tied those into Homeric epic. Virgil is writing and is working in exactly the opposite direction. He looks at the events of his present day and the events of Roman history as he knows it, and writes an epic to give a mythological foundation for things that have already happened. And so that's what I mean by saying that the Aeneid, unlike the Homeric epics, is written with hindsight. One of the Aeneid's main purposes, one of Virgil's main purposes, is to provide a mythological background and an explanation for Rome's subsequent development. Aeneas is fated to found the Roman people. That's what Aeneas is working towards throughout the epic, and the Aeneid is as much about the inevitability of Rome, the fact that Rome must come into existence at whatever cost, at whatever difficulty, as it is about Aeneas. Now, Romulus was, according to myth, the founder of the city of Rome in 753 BC. So when I talk about Aeneas founding Rome, I really should say Aeneas founds the Roman people. Saying Aeneas founds Rome is a kind of shorthand because Aeneas is the ultimate ancestor of the Roman people. The city of Rome is not founded until 753, and it's founded by Romulus. Virgil is providing a mythic link to the Trojan War story for the Roman people by saying that Aeneas sails from Troy to Italy, marries an Italian princess named Lavinia, and becomes the ancestor of the Roman people. And so this means that Virgil is working with the same material as Homer, the Trojan War, but he recasts the overall focus from the Greeks, as it was in the Homeric poems, to the Trojans. And this implies that Virgil, in effect, has to turn the story around, has to change who are the more admirable characters and who the less admirable characters. Now, in Homeric epic, there's no question that Trojans could be and were portrayed sympathetically. Think of the characterizations of Hector or of Priam in the Iliad, for instance. But the Trojans were doomed to defeat, and there was no doubt that the story is told from a Greek perspective. Virgil has a rather tricky problem here. The Trojans were defeated. There's no question of that. The Trojans are the ancestors of the Roman people. How do we get around the fact, then, that our glorious ancestors were beaten by the Greeks? The defeat of the Trojans cannot be allowed to cast doubt upon their worthiness, in other words, in Virgil's presentation. And therefore, the Greeks are made to seem treacherous, untrustworthy, and cruel. So it's the same Trojan War story, but approached from a very, very different perspective. The proem, again, that's the first 11 lines of the Aeneid, sets out several key themes that will be repeated throughout the epic. And these include the ideas that Aeneas's adventures are due not just to fate, but also to the goddess Juno's anger at the Trojans in general. While Virgil does not begin the epic by invoking the muse, he does, a few lines into the proem, ask the muse to remind him of the causes. What caused Aeneas so many troubles? What made his wandering so difficult? And the answer is that the goddess Juno was angry at the Trojans and took this anger out on Aeneas. In particular, she was angry at the Trojans because she is concerned for the future of Carthage, a city for which she feels a particular love. And this is a place where we can see what I mean by Virgil writing with hindsight. He knew, as we know, that Carthage and Rome would, in fact, be enemies, would fight the 3 Punic Wars that I mentioned in a previous lecture. He gives a mythological or divine sanction for that by backdating the enmity of Rome and Carthage all the way back to the anger of Juno at the Trojans in the Aeneid. In Book 4, the enmity between Carthage and Rome will be given a human motivation when the Carthaginian queen Dido vows undying hatred towards Aeneas and all his men and all his descendants because after living with her for a year, and she thought they were married, Aeneas decides to go on his way to sail off to Rome. So the enmity between Rome and Carthage is foregrounded both through the anger of the goddess Juno and through the human motivation of Dido's desire for revenge on a man who has deserted her. These themes are set up in the proem and work throughout the epic. Another theme set up in the proem that is crucially important for the whole epic is that Aeneas is characterized in line 10 of the proem as a man noted for pietas. Pietas and the related adjective pious are Aeneas's keynotes, his character notes throughout the epic. The English derivatives piety and pious are unfortunately completely inadequate to convey the sense of the Latin terms. If we refer to pious Aeneas, that doesn't get the idea across. Yes, he was pious, but that's only one element of pietas. We don't have an adequate English translation, but the closest I can come to it is to say that pietas is the quality of performing one's proper duty towards everyone to whom one owes a duty. I know that's kind of clunky and awkward, but what it means is the quality of behaving in the right, proper, appropriate, and dutiful way towards your father as a son, towards your children as a father, your wife as a husband, your followers as a leader, your gods as a worshiper. Every possible duty that you have towards anyone to whom you have a duty, the proper performance of those duties is the quality that's called pietas. And throughout the entire story of the Aeneid, Virgil foregrounds the tensions between Aeneas's own private desires and his pietas, between what Aeneas would do if it were up to him, if he could choose as a private individual with no obligations and with no duty towards the future Roman people and towards his own followers, calling him away from his private inclinations. What he would choose to do as a private individual and what he must do as a leader, a father, a son, the son of a goddess, in fact, the goddess Venus, the Roman equivalent of Aphrodite, who has told him he must go on to Italy and found a new people, and most importantly, what he will do as a founder of a new people, the tension between his individual desires and those duties, his pietas, runs throughout the epic. And behind it all, again, is our sense that we know as Roman readers in Virgil's day, our sense that Rome must happen. And this leads me to the third point, the third theme that's foregrounded in the proem and that is important throughout the epic, the idea that Rome must happen, but Rome, good and great though it may be, comes at a great cost to individuals. In line 33 of the poem, both Rome's inevitability and its cost are stressed when we're told, when Virgil, speaking in the narrator's voice, says that it was a great molus to found the Roman people. Molus means burden, heavy undertaking, task, weighty responsibility. It was a great molus to found the Roman people. And remember, Virgil is writing at a time when the terrible civil wars, the struggles for power before and after the death of Julius Caesar, are very, very fresh in the Roman memory. We know that once Octavian won the Battle of Actium, civil war did not come back, that society became stable, that Octavian as Augustus reigned until 14 AD, but people living at the time could not have known that the civil wars would not come back again. And so the idea that Rome is something that must be protected despite the heavy cost to individuals would have been very, very pertinent in a time when there was probably a good deal of anxiety that people might rebel again, that people might try to overthrow the status quo once again. Now, the overall storyline of the Aeneid mirrors both Homeric epics, but in reverse order. Virgil does what Homer does in half the time and backwards. The Aeneid is 12 books long as opposed to the 24 books of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and Virgil starts with the Odyssey. The first 6 books of the Aeneid are the Odyssean half, then moves on to the Iliadic half in books 7 through 12. The first 6 books describe Aeneas's wanderings after he leaves his devastated homeland, Troy. Book 1 sets the scene, both in the proem and later. In this book, Aeneas and his men are shipwrecked on the coast of Africa. They take refuge with Dido, queen of Carthage, and Aeneas agrees to tell her the stories of his wanderings from leaving Troy to being shipwrecked on her coast. So just as Odysseus narrates his own adventures in book 9 through 12 of the Odyssey, so Aeneas narrates his own adventures to Dido in books 2 through 3 of the Aeneid. And Aeneas's account, or Virgil's account, of the sack of Troy in Book 2 of the Aeneid is the fullest account of the sack we have. Most of our details of the Trojan horse, for instance, come from the Aeneid. People who haven't read the Iliad assume the story of the Trojan horse is in the Iliad. It isn't. The Iliad ends with the funeral of Hector, well before the end of the war. The Trojan horse is alluded to in passing in the Odyssey, but the place where we have the most details about the Trojan horse is Book 2 of the Aeneid, told from the point of view of the Trojans, who were tricked and destroyed because of this ruse by the Greeks. It's in Book 2 of the Aeneid that the famous words Timeo Danaos et dona ferentes, I fear the Greeks even when bearing gifts, are spoken by Laocoon, a man who tries to warn the Trojans against the gift of the Trojan horse and is punished by being crushed to death, Laocoon and his sons together, by snakes. The tradition that Aeneas fled Troy and founded another city in the west comes from the Iliad. Virgil did not make this up. Virgil did not make up the idea that Aeneas got away, sailed west, and founded another city. That's mentioned just in passing in the Iliad, where Aeneas is, no, I won't say a minor character, but certainly not one of the major characters. In the Iliad, Poseidon mentions that Aeneas is not fated to die at Troy, that he'll sail away to the west and he'll found another city. That is picked up by Roman tradition, and particularly by Virgil, to say, what other city did he found? Well, he didn't exactly found the city of Rome, but he founded the people, the Roman people. He founded another society in the west. So Virgil is drawing on the Iliad when he has Aeneas leave Troy, escape from the burning Troy, sail west, and become the ancestor of the Romans. But again, Virgil has something of a problem. What is a great warrior supposed to do when his city is being sacked by the enemy? Turn tail and run? Take to his ships and found another city in the west? No, he's supposed to stay and die fighting. And so Virgil has to make sure that Aeneas does not appear to be disloyal or a coward when he leaves Troy. This is done very, very effectively, again narrated in Aeneas' own voice, when he describes how he wanted to stay and die fighting, but his mother Venus, the goddess Venus, appeared to him, told him that he must leave, told him it was his destiny to leave, and also Venus shows Aeneas the gods fighting behind the scenes, so to speak. She pulls away the veil that normally makes the gods and what's going on the divine level invisible to humans, and she says, look, over there, Apollo is fighting on that wall. There is Neptune. There is Juno. In other words, she shows Aeneas both the inevitability of Troy's destruction, and she tells him that he must leave. So he is leaving not because he wants to, but because he has direct divine sanction and, in fact, a direct divine command to leave. Now, in his narrative to Dido, Aeneas recapitulates the wanderings of Odysseus in the Odyssey. He follows in Odysseus' steps and visits the same scenes without even knowing it, and his encounter with Dido reflects the Odyssey in another way, just as Odysseus' homecoming to Penelope is threatened by females who want to keep him with them, so Dido threatens Aeneas' eventual arrival in Italy and marriage to Lavinia because she wants Aeneas to stay with her and be her husband. The Odyssean half of the Aeneid culminates with Aeneas' visit to the underworld, where he speaks to the ghost of his father Anchises. Anchises shows him a vision of the future, specifically a pageant of souls who will be born as great Roman heroes to come. And when Aeneas steps back out of the underworld into the land of the living at the end of Book 6, he's ready to set Troy and the Odyssean half of his journey behind him and move on to Italy and his destiny. This is where the Aeneid turns towards its second or Iliadic half. Now, most modern readers tend, by and large, to prefer the first half of the Aeneid. We just find the Odyssean adventures more interesting than the somewhat interminable seeming battles in Italy. But ancient readers preferred the second half of the Aeneid, considered books 7 through 12 the greater part of the work. And Virgil himself says in book 7 that he's turning to a greater work. So he seems to consider the second half the better part of the Aeneid. In books 7 through 12, Aeneas is embroiled in wars over his desire to marry Lavinia, or his destined need to marry Lavinia, an Italian princess. The wars occur because Lavinia is already engaged to a man named Turnus, and understandably enough, Turnus does not simply accept when Aeneas shows up that the gods have decided Lavinia should marry Aeneas rather than Turnus. Turnus takes it a bit hard that this stranger has shown up and wants to claim Turnus's fiancée, and the upshot is a series of battles between Aeneas's followers and Turnus's followers. Throughout the second half of the Aeneid, Virgil continues to stress both Aeneas's pietas and the human cost of these wars between Trojans and Italians. And it's perhaps not too fanciful to see a direct reflection, again, of the recent civil wars, such things as the Battle of Philippi, in Virgil's treatment of the wars between two lines of Roman ancestors. Because just as Aeneas marries Lavinia, so Aeneas's followers intermarry with native Italian families. So the war between Aeneas and Turnus is a war not between two enemies from different cultures from the Roman point of view, but between two different strands of Roman ancestors. In the end, Aeneas kills Turnus in single combat, and the scene of Turnus's death ends the epic. Now, when Aeneas wounds him, Turnus admits defeat and begs for mercy. He recognizes that he deserves to be killed, that Aeneas has the right to kill him, but he invokes the memory of Aeneas's father Anchises and asks Aeneas to pity his own father, Turnus's father, Daunus. Turnus concludes by saying, "Lavinia is your wife. Do not go further in your hatred. I admit it, I yield. Lavinia is yours. Stop at this point." Now Aeneas hesitates, but then he notices that Turnus is wearing on his shoulder the baldric, the sash or belt, of a young man named Pallas, whom Turnus had killed. Pallas had been under Aeneas's direct protection. Turnus had killed him and is flaunting the spoils that he took from Pallas's dead body. Aeneas says, Pallas strikes this blow, stabs Turnus to death, and the last line of the Aeneid tells us that Turnus's soul flees to the shadows of the underworld. Now, this final scene of the epic raises many crucial points of interpretation. What I want to focus on here is the question of whether Aeneas acted correctly and with justification when he killed Turnus. One critical stance, one scholarly stance taken on this question, was Aeneas justified in killing Turnus, is that it would be wrong for Aeneas not to kill Turnus at this point. This view, this reading of the end of the Aeneid, says that Aeneas must not leave Pallas unavenged. To do so would be to fail in his pietas towards both Pallas, his dead friend, and Pallas's father, who had handed the young man over to Aeneas with special instructions to watch out for him, to protect him. In this reading, Aeneas's hesitation when Turnus pleads for his life indicates magnanimity and humanity, but it would be anachronistic to expect Aeneas to spare his enemy on the battlefield and to let Turnus live. Had Turnus been left alive, for one thing, he would have been a focal point for Aeneas's enemies and thus always a temptation to rebellion against Aeneas. So, in this reading of the crucial final scene of the Aeneid, Aeneas acts through anger on behalf of Pallas, yes, but justified anger is not to be seen as a negative thing in this context. And the group of scholars who take this reading say the end of the Aeneid therefore shows Aeneas acting appropriately for a leader and should be read as a positive ending, an upbeat, positive, good ending. But there is an equal and opposite scholarly interpretation, which argues that killing Turnus represents Aeneas's failure at this crucial, supreme moment of the epic to embody the ideals set out for him throughout the Aeneid. Turnus invokes the memory of Aeneas's father Anchises in his plea for mercy, and this has two implications. Turnus's reference to Anchises, first and foremost, reminds the reader of the last time Anchises appeared in the epic, in the underworld journey of Book 6. And there, when Anchises was showing Aeneas a pageant of future Roman heroes, showing him a procession of souls who would be born as Romans to come, Anchises gives advice to the future Romans. He speaks to a Roman. He says, "You, Roman, remember this." So he's speaking to his son Aeneas, but he's also speaking to the future Romans. And Anchises' advice is to spare the defeated or the submissive and battle down the proud. In Latin, parcere subjectis et debellare superbos. Spare the submissive, spare the defeated, battle down, conquer the proud. What is Turnus at this point? Submissive, defeated, kneeling before Aeneas, saying, "Lavinia is your wife, do not press your hatred further." So on this interpretation of the scene, Aeneas directly contravenes the advice, the last advice his father ever gave him in the underworld. On this reading, when Aeneas hesitates, he's behaving appropriately as a leader. He's subordinating his private desire for vengeance to the greater good of knowing when mercy is appropriate. And so on this reading, Aeneas kills Turnus out of private emotion, not out of public duty, because he is overcome by personal anger, grief, and desire for vengeance. And therefore, the end of the Aeneid shows Aeneas acting inappropriately as a leader and should be read overall as a negative ending. Now, you could hardly get two more directly opposing readings of the end of an extremely important work of literature. I'm not going to try to sort it out for you. There are these two schools of thought, and both of them have a great deal to be said for them. These questions resonate beyond the immediate scene, and they have implications for our overall understanding of the epic. So while this is a hard scene to interpret, it's a very important one. Aeneas is, in many ways, emblematic of later Roman culture and values, and especially of leadership, and thus Virgil's portrayal of Aeneas can be read as, at least in some sense, a commentary on the leadership of Augustus. Now, it's probably oversimplistic to cast this interpretive question in the form of, is the Aeneid pro-Augustan propaganda, though it's often put that way on essay tests on final exams, for instance, just to see what the students can do with it. It would be probably oversimplistic to call the Aeneid either pro-Augustan or anti-Augustan propaganda, but certainly a commentary on Augustus's leadership, on Augustus's political program, is within the Aeneid, and the text can be and has been read in radically different ways, both as supporting Augustus and as protesting against some of the more authoritarian and strong-arm aspects of Augustus's political program. Whatever Virgil meant us to make of the end of the Aeneid's influence on later literature has been profound. Ambiguous or not, it stands as one of the most important texts in the Western literary tradition. In late antiquity, It was one of the most commonly read and cited works from the classical world. As we'll see in Lecture 24, the last lecture in this part of the course, St. Augustine talks about how when he was a youth, he wept over Dido's death when he read the Aeneid. He finds this troubling. He says, here I was weeping over the death of a literary character when I should have been weeping over the state of my own soul. Other Christian authors justified their admiration for Virgil by allegorizing and reinterpreting his work, viewing him as an anima naturaliter Christiana, a soul naturally Christian. You couldn't say that Virgil had been a Christian because, unfortunately, rather awkwardly, he died in 19 BC, so he died before the birth of Christ. But later Christian writers found Virgil so compelling that they said, well, he was a proto-Christian before Christianity. He was a soul naturally Christian. The Aeneid's influence continued into the Middle Ages. In part 3 of this course with Professor Noble, you'll study Dante's Divine Comedy, and that, of course, is the most obvious example of the direct influence of the Aeneid. Dante includes Virgil as a character in both the Inferno and the Purgatorio, and much of Dante's narrative in the Inferno is modeled directly on Aeneid, Book 6, the underworld journey. And the Aeneid's popularity and influence continued throughout the Renaissance and after. The works of such authors as Marlowe, Spenser, and Milton are absolutely unimaginable without Virgil and without the Aeneid. In our next lecture, we will move on to one more Roman poet, a very, very different one, and we'll talk about the work of Ovid, particularly his great mythological text, Metamorphoses.